come from? What does this mean? I don't know. Oh yes, I know what it means. The answer is a lot of different places. Yeah, we tend to think of things like smartphones, the iPhone, Lord knows what version that is, 5, nobody knows, nobody cares. But the idea is, we tend to focus on the focal innovation, whether it be hardware or software or a service innovation, and then we try to sort of say, well, where did that come from? And you say, oh, it's this great inventor or this idea, and we trace it back to an individual in a certain moment in time. Yeah? And it's very, 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 very misleading. Okay? Because when you actually dig a bit deeper, you often find out there are multiple sources for any focal innovation, and often they're scattered across time. So lots of people might have the idea for an innovation, but there are things that currently are not possible, or they're possible, but they're too expensive, or they're too large, or they're too energy consuming. And there's a series, if you like, of bottlenecks or missing parts of the puzzle. So with most innovations, and we'll give some examples in a moment, there are multiple sources. Okay, so the trick is to identify those. And the second thing is they're often scattered across time. And the time dimension is terribly important. And that's why you get these sterile arguments. You say, who invented the jet engine? And everyone, depending on your nationality, you'll say, it's the Brits, because XYZ invented it in 1952 or whatever. And the Germans say, hold on a moment, A, B, and C invented it in 1952 or sometime 1951. And the Americans say, no, but it wasn't debugged until 19... And they have these sterile debates. And it's partly because of the multiple, where did it come from? But it's also partly because often there are particular, not always technological, there could be regulation, there could be demand, but often there are technological bottlenecks that people are waiting to be solved. And once they are solved or are viable financially, falls into place and it's possible. And that's why you often get multiple claims to the origins of innovations almost simultaneously, sometimes within months or at least within a year, because often there's a piece missing and there's a breakthrough either in a sort of cost performance or something's possible that wasn't possible earlier. So there's two things happening there. There's the multiple sources, which is really, really important, because otherwise we just sort of try to identify a single person often. Yeah. So we're saying here, Steve Jobs was important, but not as important as you might think. Okay, or he thinks or thought, past tense. Yeah. And secondly, equally importantly, is this time dimension, this timeline. Okay, certain things become possible. That's why often these things happen simultaneously in different places. So we'll come back to all these issues. Okay, so the point of being here is those two things, yeah? Is that there were bottlenecks in terms of this. The main bottlenecks in terms of the smartphone were battery technology. Batteries were too big and couldn't store enough energy. Okay, and that was a big impediment. And the other one was the interface. Maybe with the exception, maybe not, with BlackBerry, putting a full QWERTY keyboard on a portable device was very complex mechanically, but also it takes up too much space and real estate. Yeah? So most people were waiting for touch screens, which have been available for 20 years before smartphones, to become small and cheap enough to be in a portable device, because they've been used in industry for years in chemical plants and such like. Yeah. So they were two of several bottlenecks that came together. And when they came together, you get this sort of simultaneous attempts to figure out, we can do this now technically. Can we make it work in terms of finance and such like? Okay, and if you fast forward, then you see even now there are multiple inputs to almost any innovation you can think of, probably, yeah? But most innovation. So in this case, one of many, ARM, we've mentioned before. ARM, this time last year, was a relatively well-known British company that designs and licenses chip designs. It was acquired, I think, early this year or late last year by SoftBank of Japan. But that's double the workforce in the UK. It's from 5,000 to 10,000 engineers or something up in Cambridge. Foxconn, I believe, is a Taiwanese company. Is that right? Although most of their plants are in mainland China. Mainly the manufacturing. Sharp, until recently, supplied the screens for iPhone. I'm not sure who the provider is now. It might be Corning with the Gorilla Glass. I don't think it is. But basically, we're saying it's not just the development, but also the manufacturing refinement, the continuous innovation is not a central theme here. Okay, and Nokia, despite what Apple claimed in court and had to pay damages, uses a lot of technology, the firmware from Nokia, ironically perhaps in hindsight. Okay, so you see there's multiple inputs and there are many more. Okay, it's not a point to make that, haha, anyone can do this. Okay, but it's a different challenge. It's how you identify the sources and then how you integrate them in some way. And later in the module, when we look at forecasting, this is one of the tricks. Often there are missing parts, or there are technologies that haven't been fully developed or debugged, and the issue is, when might that be possible? So a lot of forecasting is anticipating when certain either commercial or financial, technological points are crossed that make something possible. Okay? Okay. All right, okay, so multiple inputs and sources, but also distributed across time. It's getting a little bit sci-fi, isn't it? Okay, so where do innovations come from? Well, we said, okay, ideas have a role, and in a moment we're going to look at some ways of generating ideas more systematically. They are the starting point of that simple linear model where you start off from an idea or an invention, and then you sort of go through some sort of process and you commercialize it and it's successful or not. Okay, and we're saying it's not that simple or simplistic. There are multiple inputs, okay, and that's really, really important. So the point here is not that it's often one, it's often a combination of several of these that come together, sort of a confluence at a certain point in time that makes something possible that wasn't possible prior to that. Yeah? Okay. Some of these were dig a bit deeper in a moment, but I'll just run through the sort of clock, just briefly give you a flavour of it, and then some of these were dig down a bit deeper, okay? Advertising, how on earth can that be a source of innovation? Any thoughts? Because advertising is about promotion, isn't it? So why would you think it, how can it be a source potentially of innovation? It's got a very bad press, quite rightly, but how could it, in what ways could it be a source of innovation?
Types of advertising?
Hmm?
The different types of advertising?
Yeah.
Could be more digital, more...
Yeah, so how might, for example, a lot of advertising now is social media sponsored or more hidden, implicit sort of thing. But how might social media promotions be a source of innovation? Yeah, well, it's symmetrical. They can either try to stimulate a need, latent or otherwise. Latent simply means sort of not expressed, yeah? So it's something we don't articulate. You don't say, I need this. But when it happens, you might think, actually, I want this. Yeah, so they use the term quite loosely. So it might be one of stimulation that creates a new market or a new service or a new product category. Yeah, or it could be the flip side. You can use social media to try to identify. So there's lots of advertising organisations whose day job it is to data mine and look for non-obvious patterns. Yeah, because most consumer surveys and focus groups are so small, they're very hard to identify these sort of latent needs. So often you need very large data sets and quite clever AI to try to identify these sort of latent needs. So it's symmetrical, yeah? So it can be used for that purpose. Inspiration, Archimedes, depending on how shaky your history is. But the idea is that you sort of seek inspiration in some way, okay? How might you go about that? And we'll talk about that in a moment because it's one of the areas of creativity. But how might you go about, do you just wait for it to happen? How might you stimulate that? Yeah, exactly. There are two completely different schools of thought here, both supported by different research. One is isolation. Yeah, literally the Archimedes moment, where you go in isolation, away from all the noise and distractions of work and friends, and you think. Yeah, and you think in isolation, and you may go mad, you may not, but often there are lots of studies that suggest that's one route. So isolation from all the noise and hubris. Yeah, but the polar opposite. Your point there is also supported empirically, is that you seek stimulation, either by social interaction and or by the environment in which you're in. Okay, and that's a different way of using it. So once you recognise it as being a legitimate source, you can say, well, how, in this particular case, is it one of isolation or is it one of stimulation? If it's stimulation, is it a social network interaction or is it more an environmental one, which is a different thing? And therefore you can actively seek that out. Okay, most of these are about, they happen anyway, but how might we make them not simply accidental or random, yeah? How might we make them more likely to happen? Okay, knowledge push, sometimes called technology push, but I'd argue that technology is a subset of knowledge. I mean, knowledge is a tricky one. We've got a session on knowledge and IP and that, and I know some of you, sorry about this, are doing a module on knowledge and stuff like that. And one of the tricks, one of the problems or challenges is it doesn't really exist. You can't grab it. You know, you can sort of try to wrap it and codify it and give it names and such like. And we'll talk about ways of doing that when we look at that later in the module. But technically, knowledge is harder to tie down than technology. Okay, so technology, I say, is included within the term knowledge. So the idea of knowledge push or technology push, okay, is well established in innovation, research and practice. Yeah, and that's much more like that simplistic linear model. You know, stuff comes out of science, or it comes out of technology, or an invention, and then you debug it and you commercialize it. Okay, so it's probably the default setting for most people. Yeah, okay. And what's the challenge with that? What's the, if you like, what's the, to mix my Greek things, what's the Achilles heel of knowledge push as a source of innovation? Or what's the challenge or challenges? Yeah, there's is there a demand for it? And what is the demand? How might you use it? Yeah, the fact that it's new and shiny, whether it's an invention or a patent or a piece of knowledge, yeah, what's the utility? How do you create value from it? Yeah, and that's not automatic or easy. Yeah, so one trick is linking it to the sort of value proposition, if you like, or the value creation. And what are the other, any other challenges with taking knowledge push as a source of innovation? Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, we just had the demand one. Yeah, sorry. Hmm? Bad. Oh, bad innovation. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Okay, yeah. Gotcha, yeah. I mean, yeah, there's a sort of pro-innovation bias going on here. The assumption is it's generally good stuff, but you're dead right. A lot of, not only knowledge push, but also demand pull. You know, it's either neutral in terms of its social utility or negative. So there certainly are issues of, it can be done, but should it be done? Yeah, so there is certainly that, particularly in the sort of social, political domain, yeah, rather than products, maybe? Yeah, I don't know, yeah, but certainly there's an issue of the nature of that knowledge, yeah? Any other challenges before we move on? So there's obviously the issue of, you know, knowledge that actually it's hard to reverse, but actually may have negative consequences, intended or otherwise, and there's the issue of trying to match it with some sort of value creation and demand. And what's the other, more obvious challenge?
Maybe when you create a new product and you need to test and do a lot of experiments to test if it's can be used or is can be implemented to the public. So maybe the experiment maybe require input of new knowledge. That's maybe one of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, without paraphrasing, I think one of the challenges is new knowledge, not necessarily new knowledge, but knowledge that you've identified as being novel to the organisation or the individual is often not very well formed. So one of the challenges is recognising its value. I don't mean value in terms of final commercial utility, but it's easy to ignore this stuff. Yeah, and a lot of the stuff when you look at creativity is trying to stop ourselves from prematurely ignoring or judging stuff, prejudging, prejudice, yeah? So a lot of the things in creativity training, which we'll get to in a moment, is trying to make a step back and not prematurely dismiss some technology or knowledge as being irrelevant, yeah? Because we all have our sort of behavioural and cognitive biases. We'll come back to that. Okay. Need pull, we sort of, is the flip side problem, yeah? You can do lots of market research and focus groups. You can data mine big data sets and try to identify these latent needs. All well and good, yeah, but then the question is, can you, or should you, your point about bad innovation, can you or should you attempt to meet those needs? Because certain things will be impossible, currently, technically, and that's when things like forecasting come in. When might it be possible? And where should we look? Is it universities, suppliers? Where should we look, yeah? And we'll talk about that when we look at forecasting. Okay, users as innovation is a big deal at the moment. There's certain sort of, what do you call it? Not trends, fashion in sort of management areas. And one of the big fashions that's come back, it's not new, it started off with von Hippel's like 30 years ago, is the idea that trying to identify users as a source of innovation. So this is a relatively old source, if you like, well understood, but it's come back into fashion in a slightly different way. So like 25, 30 years ago, it was all about trying to identify what we call lead users. We mentioned these briefly a few weeks ago. Yeah, the idea of lead users, which came from Erich von Hippel's work. And lead users have certain characteristics. And in his studies, it was all about lead users are by definition knowledgeable, sophisticated, they lead the main market, etc. Some acid tests there. And the idea was, how do you identify them, how do you work with them, yeah, how do you co-develop with them. That's all good. So things like extreme users, sports equipment, medical devices, those sorts of areas where it requires literally hands-on experience, deep knowledge, okay? And those areas are well researched, okay? But more recently, the user innovation stuff has sort of moved on a bit away from just looking at how, if you like, experts, users or lead users work, and looking at, if you like, bigger data sets, things like so-called democratic innovation or free innovation. So things like crowdsourcing, things like internet competitions. Okay, so things where it's larger numbers involved, not necessarily sophisticated users or expert users, but the difference is it's sheer numbers. Yeah. So the trick is then to identify some coherent inputs from those. Okay, so there's a whole range of stuff that started off with these expert users, the lead users, and right up until now, where the main focus has moved away from that and more looking at these sort of large data sets and how you can extract knowledge from these large banks of users. Yeah, so it's a very broad and rich seam and source. Okay, yeah, forecasting or futures or whatever you want to call it, bottom right hand side there, we're going to spend a whole session on. It's really important, which is why we're going to spend a whole session on it. But basically saying that, okay, forecasting, because once you recognize the multiple source idea and the fact that it's unevenly distributed across time, then forecasting has a different role than simply trying to guess what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time. Okay, it's fundamentally different. It's understanding, if you like, what is important, what is missing, okay, or what isn't fully developed, and watching it, and then based on its sort of evolution, understanding when might that be possible. Yeah. Okay, a bit like electric vehicles at the moment. Everyone's talking about autonomous vehicles, but we're quite away from that. But electric vehicles are a good example. All the consultants, as they always do, say the same thing. We're about to reach a tipping point. Depends how you define that. Yeah, but one of their reasons they claim that is partly demand, more regulation on diesel particulates, for example, but it's mainly about supply. Yeah, the technology is getting to a stage where the energy density, at least for lithium ion, energy density, cost, performance is getting to a point where it can almost compete without direct subsidies. I say almost, it depends on the configuration and range. Yeah? So they're talking about that. So that's an area where you can sort of predict for the last 25 years roughly what the rate of improvement was, and you sort of predict sometime in the next few years there'll be a crossover point. Yeah? And that may be sooner if they legislate against particulates, it may be later if they don't. Okay, but it's a matter of when, not if. And that's how you use forecasting. Okay, you look at the sort of trends and then try to identify certain events that might influence those trends. And we'll talk about that when we look at that stuff. Okay, let's go around the clock. Regulation. How might regulation be a source of innovation? You often think of it as an impediment. When you talk to companies in particular, what they say is we need less regulation or we need deregulation. And that may be good or bad, who knows. But in terms of a source of innovation, how might regulation be a source of innovation? Because it's not that obvious, is it? You tend to see it as a constraint. Yeah?
You look forward to things to approach like the task in a different way because they've been restricted. They can't do this way. They have no option but to find the.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, it could direct or constrain where you look, where you search, where you put your R&D, where you put your talent. So it may say these things you can't do anymore at a certain point, or they're going to be very expensive, they're going to be sort of priced out or regulated away. So you tend to divert your resources and your attention to other areas. So certainly by directing search, and you can see that at the moment everyone's saying diesel isn't dead, but believe me, it is dead. It's a matter of when. And there's a lot of political will to keep it alive because lots of countries have sort of very low-grade tar fields that they've still got to deplete. But there's also a lot of public disquiet about the benefits, the downside, yeah. Yeah, it could be price or cost driven also, yeah. You could have, that's more about regulation and deregulation, yeah. So we had the example low cost airlines a few weeks ago. That wouldn't exist partly without deregulation and then they start to look for these sort of blue ocean markets that were very price sensitive. So it's a good example. Okay, so regulation is not simply a constraint. Okay, it can be, as I say, it can direct search in certain areas. I mean, search as in maybe research, maybe development. Okay. Next one up, a fancy name for basically what we've been saying since day one. I don't care what you call it, recombinant innovation, sometimes called architectural innovation, but nothing to do with buildings. It's basically saying putting stuff together. Yeah, it's an observation that many, many innovations are combinations of others. Not necessarily physical components, it may be, but it may be combinations of services and processes and such like. So the idea behind whatever you call it, recombinant, architectural, doesn't matter, okay, is again this multiple inputs, it's multiple sources. Okay, so whether it's an electric vehicle, whether it's an iPhone, yeah, whether it's a university degree, there are multiple inputs, some innovating at different rates, some have more, some have less opportunity to innovate than others. So it's trying to understand where the innovation might happen. Okay? And we'll give some examples later on. Okay, watching others is a bit spooky. It's called many other things. Ethnographic is another one. What other ones we got? Yeah, one of the big exponents of that would be Tom Kelly's consultancy group. But basically, there are certain methods, and we may look at some later on. But basically, it's a systematic way of usually directly working with or observing users in action. Yeah. So the idea is you get a deep knowledge. So it's different to engaging with users and users being innovators. That's different. You know, this is stepping back. It's not quite that far, but it's trying to understand in a deep sense. So it's not surveys, not online polls. Working with them, observing them in real life, trying to understand how do they actually do stuff. Okay, try to identify any problems, impediments, and then try to innovate around that. Okay, so it has a long tradition of trying to understand these sort of unarticulated needs. Works a lot in business to business as well as business to consumer. It's very time consuming, very resource intensive, but it yields insights that you wouldn't get just by, say, interviewing or surveying. Okay. Accidents. They will happen. Okay, serendipity. That's a more posher word for it. We have, if you read the BMEC newsletter, which means none of you, but if you read the BMEC newsletter, I think it was last week or last month, one of my colleagues, I can't take any sort of anything from it, but I think it's £1.5 million over 2 years or 3 years to look at the role of serendipity, accidents, if you like, randomness in biomedical research. Okay, and again, this has a very long tradition over 20, 30 years. How much is, if you like, structured and planned? And there's a stream of research at the moment, again from another colleague in Sprue, who argues differently and says, no, it's all about planning and you know, mission-orientated innovation. And then we have other colleagues saying, well, that's part of the story, but there's a lot of serendipity happening as well. Yeah, it's a nice word, serendipity, isn't it? It sounds like a Disney word. But the idea is that accidents happen, but the question is how, if you like, what are the conditions for them to be a source of innovation?
They can't be controlled, they kind of just have to happen out of your plan of life, like penicillin.
Yeah.
Went on holiday and came back and found this opera and there's speakers.
Yeah.
That's actually useful.
Yeah, okay, good example. But what are the, if you like, what are the conditions? And one is it happens, and it's a random thing. It's hard to force it. It's not like experimentation. That's a separate thing, which we may talk about later. Experimentation is structured. You can isolate a variable, blah, blah, blah. You have a control group. That's the scientific method, sort of, yeah? But this is almost the opposite to the scientific method, in the sense that stuff happens, yeah? And we've spoken about this before. When you look at the stuff that comes from, say, IT in California, you know, in coding, you make mistakes, you know, lean development, and you improve upon them. That's fine. But it also happens in other areas. You just point, you know, in scientific endeavours as well. But what's the condition for it to be a source of innovation? So one is, if you like, it's not planned or controlled. It's not experimental. Okay, that's not an accident. You may fail an experiment, but that's not an accident. That's an outcome that gives you knowledge. So put experimentation to one side for a moment and bring accident onto the table. What's the condition for it to be a source of innovation? Yeah.
Having a process in place that will look at everything, record everything, and allow it to be repeated.
Yeah, not necessarily a process, that would be great. Yeah, but maybe prior to that, you know, the sensitivity, if you like, to recognise that it's happened and not simply ignore it. Because even in a scientific environment, often you think, I'll tidy up the data set, I'll truncate the data. That's an outlier. That just messes up my graphs, yeah? And you find a lot of organisations will just either ignore or tidy these things away. They're just slightly embarrassing. Yeah, and you get on with what you're doing. So the trick is, you're right, is to be sensitive to and recognise the potential opportunity of such random events. Okay, that's easy to say, very hard to actually institutionalise. So it may be a process, but I think prior to the process, you also need, basically, train people to be able to recognise, yeah, and as you say, record, and then something has to happen about that. And that's, again, a difficult thing to institutionalise, because most of us, despite what people like Google say, aren't rewarded for failure. Okay, so often we just bury these or ignore them. But it certainly is a well-documented source of innovation. Okay, the last one, and I'm sure there are many others, but this gives you an idea, it's not just about ideas, if you like, are sort of more sort of shocks to the system. So they could be regulatory, they could be social, they could be demographic, they could be wars, they could be disease, hopefully not those two things. But again, they stimulate certain actions. Yeah? So whether it's the Great Depression or the Great Plague, you know, these things stimulate innovations which probably wouldn't happen without them. Okay, it's not automatic, but it's an observation. Okay, so these shocks, one is to try to anticipate them and then try to be ready to react to them. And again, we'll talk about that when we look at scenarios and other planning techniques like Delphi when we look at forecasting. But what I'm trying to say is we need a much broader repertoire than simply focusing on